Start a Q&A session, and again, tell us your name and your affiliation, or if you're a student. A lot of the students have to go back to class. But we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and you have an extraordinary group of people up there, so please let us know. Is that mic working?
No.
Yes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Mike Young. I'm a alumnus from the School of Mines. Graduated back in the 80s. I used to work for the State Department. But the question I have for you guys, especially Amy, you said that we're just going to have to adapt to some of these crises and climate change, things like that. Have you thought about, or and this is a question for any of you, how resiliency, is going to play a role in how people are just going to adapt, as opposed to just doing it, and how policy-wise or otherwise should we focus on getting populations to be more resilient, either through policy methods or other methods?
So let me just say that there is a role, obviously, for government, and there is a role for technology innovation. And some of the technologies that the previous panel talked about coming as solutions, they can be married together with, for 3 decades, people have been coming to the School of Mines and talking about transition scenarios and solutions. But some of these solutions have in them inherently things that will actually also mitigate the climate. So if you think about coastal erosion and severe storms, I can tell you from living in Houston, there's a group of scientists in Texas that work on if we restore wetlands, if we restore mangroves, if we restore forestry, how much solution can that bring, not only by creating a sink, but also by protecting human life and property. And when we think about the electricity system, it's always been the case that scale economies mean that we want to have a big centralized plant and we want to lay wires from that plant and so forth. But we're going to have to think about how we do things differently, and that's going to vary by geography. In some geographies, the panel talked about sort of the justice of climate change, right? So there are going to be places where people are already not at the proper level of economic development, and maybe in some places climate change is going to make that much worse. But maybe some of these new technologies that we're looking at are going to be better suited to deliver energy solutions to people in a small scale way. And in a flexible way. Morgan and I wrote an article a few months ago where we looked at, and you think about Puerto Rico, Tesla Energy, so not the car part of the company, but the battery storage and solar panel division of the company, was able to go to Puerto Rico, and in 3 days, once specialists could come and clear the sort of wires that were dangerous, they were able to install solar panels and a battery system for hospitals in Puerto Rico in 3 days, right? So if you think about refugees, and you think about movements of population, which we keep seeing over and over again on the news, and you think about that technology, and people are living in tents, and you think about how difficult that's going to be at higher temperatures. Well, if you could provide a fan or some kind of temperature control running off of solar and batteries that can be installed in 3 days and decommissioned in 3 days if you come up with a more permanent solution. These are things that need to be looked at. And in our national dialogue, when we pit technologies against each other, right? So we say wind is bad for natural gas, or natural gas is bad for wind. We're not going in the right direction, because what we really should be thinking about is the Congress going to pass an infrastructure bill, and how do we marry together what we need to do to have our infrastructure be more sustainable with what are the future technology per location that would deliver the best resilience and service to people. And I feel like we almost need a new market for what I call natural capital. That's sort of a buzzword in the environmental community. But let me introduce the idea to you that we just don't want to have businesses believe that their use of water is a priority, and so they're going to use water without thinking about what stewardship is, or even arable soil. And we're going to get to a point, the United States has this amazing opportunity to not only protect our own population, but to do service in the world, because we have these amazing natural resources, whether it's arid soil, whether it's forestry, our ability to raise, livestock, our ability to have clean water, agriculture. There are things that we're still going to be able to do as a country, that there are going to be other countries that are not going to be able to do that. And if we were to squander it, because there's some business profit that could be made by deteriorating that natural capital to the point where it's not available to our service anymore. I mean, people talk about the rise of China and, asymmetric warfare and drones and cyber and all these things. But the bottom line is the United States is bestowed with incredible natural resources. And if we steward them, 50 years from now or 30 years from now, when your children and their children are still in that stewardship pathway, the United States could still be the most dominant country. I don't care how much technology the Chinese think they're going to throw at everything, because we are going to have the natural resources that are going to be required to sustain, sort of a positive, resilient life. And we need to help markets develop a system where we place a value on arable soil, a value on the use of water. I mean, I don't have to tell people from Denver that you cannot produce electricity without water. Thermal plants require water, nuclear plants require water. We're not doing oil and gas production without water. And so, again, we need market solutions that incent businesses. And I was really pleased to hear the panel say today that it's important for corporations to take the lead even when government is unable to take the lead. Because ultimately, corporations can create these credit markets where they trade and add value to the natural resources that they need to do their businesses and that we need to live. And I think that when we talk resilience, that's sort of the framework around which we need to think about it, right? Which is sort of aligning our future infrastructure with these kinds of values that we have to promote to make sure that we, the United States, are a sustained economy, a sustained geography.
I was just going to say on the, very quickly on the sort of like resilience adaptation thing, I think we spend a lot less time providing frameworks for people to think about how to strategize around that. But there was a recent report, the Global Adaptation Commission, that has done a lot of really great work about various strategies for preparing for more resilient societies. And so they're launching a year of action this year. And so World Resources Institute, another think tank in Washington, was really great in writing the report with the commission. It's a great resource for folks who are trying to get their heads around a framework for thinking about mobilizing around adaptation.
Great. Lucas, you have a mic there, possibly works.
Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm from Petrobras, Brazil, and I'm a master's student here. My question is for Professor Andreas. It's related to what was spoken earlier. What's the influence of poverty and inequality on your scenarios?
Thanks, Lucas. How about I collect one or two more? Students left. Oh yeah, PK, please. You can speak loudly.
Yeah, my name is PK Sen. I'm a professor of electrical engineering. I just have one small comment and one question for Andreas. The comment I wanted to make for this whole community, we talk about carbon and we talk about renewable energy. To make a really long story short, we did not discuss at all nuclear power in our conversation here. So that's a missing component, big time. When we talk about energy, energy does not mean oil, gas, and coal. Okay. And the second point, we talk about, we completely missing the conversation on large-scale hydro in a global sense also. So those are really missing things in our conversation. One of the missing things in the conversation is electricity. We talked about the efficiency of electricity production is 33%. So no matter what we do, that's just the facts of life. So these are the missing points in our conversation. I just wanted to add my 2 cents worth of input. And the question I have for Andreas is, when you look into the green part of your first chart, did you look into nuclear power? That's supposed to be green. If carbon dioxide is the only thing we talk about here. Okay, did you include that in your conversations or in your analysis? And did you also look into globally large-scale hydro? So that's specifically for the
Okay, let's go with that. Andreas, you're on the line, I think.
Thanks, great questions. Equality, equity, inequality, justice. I mean, these are tremendously important aspects of what we're talking about here. In the end, it's not the solutions per se that are important and the technology that needs to be there and all the rest of it. It is what it does to people, and whether they feel that the future holds opportunity for them, and that's important because by sheer numbers, it will simply be a disaster if the emerging economies will have a lifestyle that resembles the lifestyle of most of the developed economies. So a lot will depend on the quality of the services that they get and the quality of life that they have, and technologicals and other solutions need to deliver that. So, but there is another element to this, which is going a little bit back to numbers. Just in the energy world, that's the world I know best, and so I stick to that. I mean, I'm not telling you news. I mean, there is more than 1 billion people lack access to clean energy services. This is a number that's probably going to rise as the population grows globally, and it is not so. So the promise of the energy transition is to deliver on that end as well, in addition to transition us into a sustainable, low carbon future. This is going to be a tremendous challenge because if you just look at the numbers and just going back to some of the scenarios that we built here, just in terms of IP, I mean, it's debatable to what extent IP is really an issue in energy, but just in terms of IP, the global distribution of patents on low carbon tech is complete unequal. You have most of the IP sitting with the OECD world and a little bit in China, and that's literally it. So the rest of the world does not hold patents on the kinds of technologies that you need going forward. Now, some of that might be able to you might overcome that by way of licensing and a whole bunch of other things. But a lot is not only about the IP itself, it's about the knowledge and the capacity to use that knowledge that comes with it. And this is exactly where inequality is a thing that is, where we are at risk of persisting a pattern that exists already. Because there is reason to assume that it's not only about the technology traveling to other places where it is needed, it is about the technology being absorbed properly into local environments, and that's exactly where the challenge is. We're not tackling this. And the energy transition, we need to get that part right of the energy transition, otherwise we'll fail on the equity front. If you look beyond patents, you find similar patterns in financial flows. I mean, the good news is that most renewable energy investment is now outside the OECD world. That looked a little bit different a couple of years back still. Now the majority of the investment is outside the OECD. But if you unpack that, it essentially is 3 countries that get it all. It's China, India, and Brazil. And just a marginal marginal share of renewable energy investment is outside those big three countries. Now, in terms of climate change, that's great news, because you want to get the money where most of the population is, most of the economic growth is, and where most of the emissions are. And that's exactly why it's good news to have most of the renewable energy investment being allocated in those three countries. But from an equity point of view, it's a disaster, because you leave out Africa, you leave out parts of Southeast Asia, you leave out parts of Latin America, and so in effect, what you get is a world that might where some parts might go happily green, and some others might not be able to do that. And so I guess one of the normative implications of all of this is that we really need to think very carefully about, not only technological solutions, but what we do with them and what they can do to people outside the areas where we see most of the investment at the moment. And maybe a final thought. I mean, the energy transition is. Sorry, I'm going for way too long here. But the energy transition is supposed to deliver all these co-benefits, right? I mean, it's not only about mitigating climate change. It's about delivering things to people that matter: health, literacy rates, because people can if they have access to energy services, they can study at home during the night. There's a whole bunch of other things that there's a whole gender component to the energy transition, which is absolutely important. In addition to countries not being able to possibly transition into a low carbon environment, all of that might not be delivered, and that's part of the justice discussion that we need to have, I think. And we're not having that discussion at the moment. Just very quickly on the scenarios. I'm trying to find an easy way out here. So the point is, we did not put in numbers, behind the scenarios. We did not say, look, this scenario X means, 25% share of coal or whatsoever. So we did not say whether nuclear is in it or out of it. What we said is the definition is low carbon tech. And I leave it open of what that means. We didn't have an agreement on this in the group.
But let me make a comment on nuclear to move on, because for nuclear, it's very important to make this comment. There's a huge potential, and obviously at scale, at a higher scale than maybe it's easier to do than renewables. Here's the problem. I don't know if you watched the HBO movie on Chernobyl. And the question is, in which settings do we have government institutions that can deliver nuclear power safely? And if you look at what the consequences might have been for Chernobyl, which luckily we didn't have the worst case scenario, but the prospect of what the worst case scenario might have been, and the fact that the Soviet Union was going to allow that to happen and then not convey those risks to the rest of Europe, when you watch that show, is quite frightening. And if you think about corruption and inefficiencies in places like China and other countries that are really pushing forward with nuclear power, I do have some concerns, not because of its ability to really deliver the kind of solutions that we need, but because of the limitation of humans in certain societies or certain political institutions to deliver it safely.
Thanks. And Sarah, how about the last word on anything?
On anything? Wow, that's quite an invitation.
The just transition part you're working on?
Yeah, I do think, listen, I think this gets to this broader dialogue here, which is, I'm worried that we are putting on energy policy a lot of societal transformation stuff that is related to some really important just transition concepts, right? So we did a project in the US called Energy in America, looking at what different communities want out of their energy system. And while I think, making sure that frontline communities are protected from climate change and making sure that there's environmental justice for, disenfranchised communities who disproportionately get the negative environmental impacts of all the energy system that we have, all these things, if we want to make sure there's a just transition for workers who are disenfranchised by the energy transition, all that stuff, we have to face two things. One, we're terrible at all those things, okay? We have systemically neglected them. So we will have to find systemic solutions for them. And some of those things are not priced into these transitions. Like, these transitions don't actually think about any of that. And secondly, when it comes to like making communities whose economies are changing quickly whole, you can't do that just through energy policy. You need a bunch of other kinds of policies. And so I do think it's really important for us to recognize that, yes, there are, as Andre said, I completely agree, there are lots of complementary benefits that come with a clean energy society, but there's a bunch of other things that we need to deal with that are put on the expectations, particularly in concepts like the Green New Deal, that are fundamentally going to be delivered in a much more sort of economically efficient and democratically responsive way if we don't just think it's like the energy sector that's going to deliver them, right? So I think that that's a whole other part of this conversation that is important to keep in mind.
That's great. Thank you all so much.